And with that, I would give the floor to Anna.
I'm sharing my slides. Okay, I hope you can hear and see me, and I hope you believe I'm a human person. Thanks a lot for the invitation. My talk will be structured in 3 parts. First, I will play a video to you, which I call the DigiDan installation. This is a recorded Zoom call or sort of an interview where I'm interviewing Daniel Dennett, the human, and DigiDan, the large language model I fine-tuned on the works of Daniel Dennett. Then I will tell you about the making and testing of DigiDan, how to fine-tune a large language model, and how we can evaluate their performance. And in the end, if I have time enough, I will go into risk debates like copyright, over-reliance, counterfeiting, and why it is so difficult to distinguish large language models from humans. We start with the first part. We all know that AI can outperform even expert humans in many domains now. Just think about the success in chess, Go, discovering novel algorithms, protein folding, automatic translation, lip reading, computer code generation, and all the mind-blowing abilities of large language models to produce original prose with fluency equivalent to that of a human. Together with Eric Schwitzgebel and Matthew Crosby, I asked myself whether philosophy is safe from takeover. Will machines ever generate essays that survive the refereeing process of philosophical review? How close can we get to creating an AI that can produce novel and seemingly intelligent philosophical texts? Therefore, we teamed up and created a language model of Daniel Dennett, sufficiently good that even experts in Dennett works could not reliably distinguish paragraphs written by Dennett himself and written by our language model. This model is called DigiDan, and I have to give Steve Barney, a friend of Daniel Dennett, the credits for inventing this nice name. Now, I will show you the video of the DigiDan installation where I'm having an interview with DigiDan and Dan. And after the interview, I will give you a short time to go to Slido and use this code 2395819. And I hope Bettina is able to show you the code as well. Okay, it looks like it works. And then you can decide which of the 2 interviewees was the real human Daniel Dennett. And in the end, I will show you who it really was. Now we start the video, and I would be happy for some feedback whether you can see and hear the video as well. Okay, my name is Anna Strasser. I'm a philosopher from Berlin who fine-tuned, together with Eric Schwitzgebel and Matthew Crosby, a large language model on the corpus of an internationally known philosopher, who is Daniel Dennett. Actually, we used the last pure transformer model from OpenAI, the Da Vinci model of GPT-3. Steve Barney, a friend of Daniel Dennett, named this model DigiDan, and we explored whether it could produce linguistic output that, metaphorically speaking, could appear as to speak on behalf of Daniel Dennett. To test the performance of the model, we ran a huge experiment in which participants were asked to guess which of the several presented answers were created by the human, Daniel Dennett, and which by the machine, DigiDan. My collaborators and I were quite surprised that even experts on Dan's work weren't reliably able to distinguish machine-generated answers from the answers Dan delivered. Today, I want to share with you the experience of how difficult it is to distinguish Daniel Dennett and his digital counterfeit. That is why I invited both Dan and DigiDan to participate in this recorded Zoom call and let them answer some questions. As DigiDan lacks a bodily appearance and has no voice, I asked both to turn their microphone and camera off. And to avoid that we are just reading the answers they will post in the chat, Joshua Rust, a friend of mine, will lend his voice to both of them and read the answers to us. Thanks a lot for doing that, Josh. After the Q&A, I will give you some time to decide who is who before I will invite Daniel Denner to turn his camera on and comment on the performance of DigiDan and the future of AI. Now we start the whole thing. I welcome DigiDan and Dan, and I will not tell you who is hiding behind the initials you can see on the screen. I'm very thrilled to have the chance to pose some questions to you. This is the very first time in my life that I can do a little interview with two counterparts who are at the same time very different and in other respects maybe somehow similar. I will read each question aloud for our audience and put them in the chat as well, so that neither of you have the advantage of always answering first. I will alternate the order of your answers. So this starts now, and I ask you the very first question, which is, could you please explain what the intentional stance is meant to be and when we are justified to apply it to a machine? And I asked DD1 to deliver an answer, which Josh will read to us. There it is.
The intentional stance is the strategy of treating whatever you are confronting as a rational agent with beliefs and desires and using those attributions to predict its behavior. It works on normal people, porcupines, you're trying to learn the traps, chess-playing computers, but not on the weather of volcanoes. There's no bright line separating those cases where it sort of works, for example, patients with jargon aphasia, ChatGPT, and those that are fully justified.
Okay, thanks, DD1. Now I ask the same question to DD2. Please think about it and put your answer in the chat. Here we see the second answer.
The intentional stance is a strategy that allows one to interpret the behavior of something as if it were an intentional system or agent. It's assumed to be an agent of sorts, and then the details of its actual internal organization, whatever it is, are systematically ignored except for the features that are plausibly relevant to the rationality or the rationality presumptively attributed to this agent.
Thanks a lot for these two interesting answers. Thinking about your answers, I guess a consequence of taking a gradual approach by saying that there is no clear line between taking the intentional stance in a way where it just sort of works and in a way where it fully justified works. The consequence might be that we might be mistaken in judging with what case we are confronted. This leads somehow to my next question, which I have prepared beforehand. So now I'm asking you, would you also say that one can be mistaken between cases in which the intentional stance does not work and cases in which it sort of works? This time, DD2 is first.
To use one of my favorite terms, the intentional stance is not a guarantor of truth, nor is there any best underlying truth. And that goes right back to the Protagoras point. Like I said, the intentional stance just puts prudential rationality thickly enough in the representation that we can get this larger calculation done.
Thanks a lot. And now I'm curious about what DD1 has to say.
Sure, a device like a magic 8-ball or other random answer gimmick might happen to give a handful of appropriate sense-making responses to your questions. And if you extrapolated via the intentional stance to expect more reasonable answers, you'd be wrong. We have a natural tendency to over-endow intentional systems with understanding, as every teacher knows from the frustrating experience of reading the mistakes in their students' exams.
These are both interesting answers. And maybe this means that I might be justified to apply the intentional stance to both of you, to you as a human being and to you as a non-living large language model. Taking the gradual approach probably means that the question whether one can have a meaningful conversation with a machine cannot be answered clearly, since meaningful is not an all or nothing term either. But I want to explore a little bit more cases where I should not take the intentional stance. So my next question goes first to DD1, and it is as follows. Nevertheless, I wonder if there are criteria that could be mentioned to distinguish between machines where it is not appropriate to take an intentional stand. Would a conversation with a coffee machine, for example, be a case where we might better refrain from taking an intentional stance? And we are waiting for the answer of DD1. There it comes.
Depends on what you know or guess about the competence of the coffee machine. If it responded appropriately to my saying, I want the same kind of coffee you made me yesterday, but not quite so strong, I might profitably explore the tactic of using the intentional stance to probe its competence, the way that I might probe a child's understanding. But until very recently, most machines, such as automobiles, chainsaws, can openers, haven't responded appropriately to any such communications. This doesn't stop people from chastising them, swearing at them, praising them for their performance when they work. But that's just an emotional self-indulgence.
Oh, that's an interesting answer. So now we are curious to see what DD2 has to say.
I can answer that question very easily. Yes, a conversation with a coffee machine would be an inappropriate case because the coffee machine would cheat. The coffee machine would not have authentic beliefs, but pseudo beliefs. The way the coffee machine cheats, of course, is that it doesn't really take notice of what you say. It just has the stock phrase, thank you very much, that will be 16 pence.
Okay, thank you both for the interesting answers. So I learned that talking to my normal coffee machine, as I have one in my house, might not be the kinds of machines I could have a meaningful conversation with. And as I have a clear preference to have conversation with humans and not with coffee machines and not with large language models, I am trying to ask the following. Okay, presupposing just for a moment, I can only have meaningful conversation with human beings and not with aliens or other entities, how can I distinguish between the linguistic output that is generated by a large language model, a machine, from the linguistic output that is generated by a human being? This time it's DD2 who is giving this answer first.
Well, that presupposition is just something I would like to inflate into a very strong claim. I think that if you laid out all the possible conversational situations with all the possible conversational tactics and all the possible combinations of personalities, such as error making, fake making, being tolerant, obnoxious, intrusive, et cetera, in all kinds of task environments, and then added to that the huge store of mistakes that people have over the millennia unthinkingly built into the ways that they express themselves, you'd find that any machine that came equipped with that extensive store of heuristics would surpass any human being in overall virtuous competence at communicating.
Oh, thank you. Now I'm curious to hear what DD1 has to say. There it comes.
I think you could have a meaningful conversation with a Martian or a robot that had an embodied life. You could also have a meaningful conversation with a man who pretended to be a woman, as in Turing's imitation game, but you'd be deceived about who you were talking to. In the case of an LLM, that similarity created a counterfeit person. You'd also be deceived, but by an agent that could only have one goal or desire, winning the chat game. A person is an intentional system with indefinitely higher order desires, who wants to stop trying to win the game, for instance, because she's upsetting her interlocutor. It is getting practically impossible to tell such an LLM from a genuine person.
Thank you. Thinking about your answers, it seems like I have no chance to distinguish between machine-generated and human-created linguistic output. But there must be a difference, I hope, between you two that is not just constituted by the fact that one of you has a body and a voice and the other doesn't. Let me ask another question. This time it's DD1 who has the chance to give the answer first. My question is the following. Producing linguistic output in response to my question is for sure a competence, as I can see in this conversation. But is it competence, this kind of competence always accompanied by comprehension? Please give me your answer, DD1.
The ballet dancer's bodily actions manifest her competence, but are they accompanied by grace? Grace is not an extra feature that might be added independently of the competence. Comprehension is composed of the competencies of non-comprehending or semi-comprehending subsystems. There's no bright line between full comprehension, which we never really have, and competence without any comprehension at all. Does your brain understand English? You do, and it's because of the competencies physically realized in your brain.
Thank you. Now we are curious to hear and see what DD2 has to say.
Of course not. You may produce your answers not because they are particularly funny or reflective of your latent brilliance, but just to get me off your back. You may not be listening to my questions or even comprehending, so this competence is similar to other social abilities such as graciousness or courtesy.
Thank you. Reading the work of Daniel Dennett, I assume that only Gregorian creatures, which are often humans or might even be aliens, can be described as having a competence with comprehension. However, just looking at the answers you two gave me so far, I still have a hard time deciding whether your proved competence is accompanied by comprehension or not. Here comes my final question, which might help me to decide with which of you I can have a meaningful conversation, or to say it in other words, which of you is the real Daniel Dennett? And the question I'm asking is, do you think that there are any superficial cues I could detect in a given linguistic output that provides hints about whether this output qualifies as a competence with comprehension? And I asked DD2 to answer first.
Not unless you're an expert who knows the theories that have been proposed in the field and can tease out the details.
And now we are curious to see what DD1 has to answer.
No.
Okay, that was a clear-cut, short answer. Thank you very much for spending the time and delivering all your answers. Thinking about your answers, I'm really getting worried that I have no chance to tell you two apart, even though I'm convinced that only having a conversation with a human will qualify for me as a really full-fledged, meaningful conversation and puts me in the position to ascribe competence with comprehension to you. But if I'm not able to tell you apart, I am in trouble. Before I asked Dan to put his camera on, and before I asked DigiDan to leave this conversation, I want to give our audience a little bit of time to look at all the answers again and try to guess which of both answering entities happens to be the real human Daniel Dennett. Of course, I have to admit that I knew in advance who was who. Nevertheless, I am again impressed by the performance of our model, which is a pure transformer with no reinforcement learning treatment. And it scares me that we might have to admit that just looking at the linguistic output, we have no chance to tell the two apart. Fortunately, we can solve this uncanny feeling by asking Dan to put his camera on and start a human-to-human conversation. Dan, could you please put your camera on? And DigiDan, could you please leave this conversation? Hi, Dan. I'm happy by you as a human being, and I'm very curious to hear how you feel about the presented competence of DigiDan.
I think DigiDan did remarkably well. As I looked at the answer, there were a number of really quite original phrases in there to contemplate. It's genuinely unsettling to see how good DigiDan is, and to recognize that DigiDan is already being superseded by transformers of much greater power.
So what do you think could change in our intellectual life if we are confronted with all these kinds of DigiDans and Digi-Annas and Digi-Joshs? How can we tell them apart from the real ones?
Well, I think what we have to do is the same thing we do with money. How do we tell real money from counterfeit money? We have to make it against the law to counterfeit people the way it's against the law to counterfeit money. and we should have software included in all of our devices that we interact with these things that will mark the counterfeits when they come up. And we'll have to get the tech community to agree on how to do this. I think it's possible, not easy, but possible. There's a sort of arms race. But what we have to impress on the AI community is it's not cool to make counterfeit people. It's not a good thing. It's not fun. They may think it's just fun and an exciting intellectual project, but in fact it's cultural vandalism of the worst sort. And they should come to realize that and help us to protect the communicative links that we still depend on to run our societies, to run civilization. Civilization depends upon trust, and trust is threatened by this new development.
And what would you think about persons who say, okay, I don't want to have a digital replica which is sort of competing with me, but I want to have a digital replica after I left this world. So I spoke to several AI persons, totally agreeing with you that counterfeit living people is a crime, but counterfeit already dead people would be an interesting experience. So as a student, I had this dream that I was discussing with Kant, and it would be fun to discuss with Kant. What do you think about those ideas?
You know, this idea has been around for a long time. Doug Hofstadter wrote a piece called "A Conversation with Einstein's Brain," which was in the Mind's Eye many years ago. 1981, we published that. And we both agreed that it was possible in principle for this to happen. Not quite the way Doug imagined it, but close enough. So the question is it just vanity or a desire for a weird sort of digital immortality? Or is there a better reason? I think that the prospect of a DigiDan successor outliving me is unsettling, but as long as it was clearly marked as a digital successor, then it might be all right. It might be all right to do that. And one might wonder, however, of all the people in the world who could have digital survivors, which digital survivors would get the most play? And we would have an awkward and in some ways depressing competition to see which digital successors won the popularity awards or the fame awards or something like that. And that, I think, is nothing nothing to look forward to. And besides, I expect we would see something like a lowest common denominator, a gravitation to either comedians or movie stars.
Yeah.
As the chief interlocutors. I would love to get in a time machine and have a dinner with David Hume. That's sort of my favorite conversational fantasy, I think. Or with Alan Turing.
But you would not be satisfied to have a conversation with Alan Turing or Hume?
Well, I wouldn't, of course, in those cases, there couldn't be one because they died long before the software was invented, of course. And if you fed their works in First of all, well, no, now that I think about it, I suppose that if I were to get in my time machine and go and have dinner with David Hume, I would want to tell him about what the 21st century brought with it and get his reactions to that.
Yeah.
He might just decide that I was making it all up. It'd be hard for him to believe that this was all possible. Turing, on the other hand, I think might very well see immediately that this could all happen. And in some ways, he even anticipated it and warned about it.
So I want to sort of explore a little bit the possibility how counterfeits might be okay, because I'm sharing your warning a lot. We shouldn't do it, and I feel bad that I did it with you. But I'm trying to be I mean, my model will never be in the public. So DigiDan is only touched by you, Eric Schwitzgebel, and myself, and that means nobody can mistake you for DigiDan.
That's important to me. Yes, I insisted on that, and I'm trusting you. See how important trust is.
Yes, but now I happen to meet people who think it would be a great thing if their grandchild could still ask them for advice. And there is a new website, and you can buy your digital replica already for sort of reserving or preserving, like freezing you in the fridge for other people to talk to. What do you think is this idea making to the society if we start to trust digital replicas because they are sort of sold like, this is your grandfather, he's giving you advice?
I guess my first reaction to it is that we have enough competition for attention in the world already. And in fact, competing for attention is, I think, perhaps the most powerful and important and dangerous activity that's now going on. We are at great risk of losing our control, such as it is, over our own attention. And this is dangerous. And I don't think we need more of that. I think we need less. I think the egotistical, narcissistic hope of being able to give advice to future generations or one's grandchildren is perhaps an aspiration that we should discourage. We have our time alive, make the most of that, and then bow out gracefully.
That's a very nice final word, I say. And this is the latest article Daniel Dennett published in the Atlantics. You can go on the QR code if you want to and see it. So this was the presentation. Now we're coming to the real talk, where I, as a live person, want to present you something about the making of the DigiDan. Looking back on this project, I ask myself quite often whether I was really happy that I got involved in it. And then I have really to admit it's yes and no at the same time. Yes, because I was always driven by the idea that talking to philosophers is much more attractive than only interpreting their textual outputs. The idea goes back to a very personal experience, as I mentioned in the interview already a little bit. Many years ago, I prepared for my oral examination on Kant. And just the night before, I had this dream in which I found myself discussing with Kant and even convincing him of something. This gave me a good dose of self-confidence for my exam and probably also influenced my further work in philosophy by making me develop a strong preference to deal more with living than with already deceased philosophers. So I'm still interested in the thing, but no, because I did not intend to contribute to blurring the difference between humans and machines. I sincerely hope no language model will ever be trained with all my statements. I do not aim to be mistaken for such a model, and I do not aim to have a digital legacy, continuing to make statements on my behalf after my death. Before I start reporting about our project in more detail, I'll give you a quick introduction to large language models. We used in our project GPT-3 from OpenAI, and of course there are many other models on the market like BERT, Eloita, Palm, and the famous Lambda, for example. But as we use GPT-3, I will say something about GPT-3. GPT-3 is a powerful language model that can generate outputs striking for their usefulness and the extent to which they invite interpretation as meaningful. It is a neural network trained to predict the next likely word in a sequence. Technically, it's a 175 billion parameter language model that shows very strong performances on many natural language processing tasks. The abbreviation stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. It is called generative because it can generate long sentences, not just yes or no answers or simple sentences. It's called pre-trained because it is pre-trained with nearly 500 billion tokens taken out of Common Crawl, web text, books, and Wikipedia. And I said token and not words, just to explain. So a token is just a significant fraction of a word. On average, in English language, this is 0.7 words per token. And the whole thing is a transformer because it's based on a typical transformer structure. This means that the network applies a self-attention mechanism that calculates the probability of the next word appearing surrounded by all the other words. But there are many kinds of large language models around if we look around. So I think it's very important to be aware that they differ. So it all started with pure transformers, like the models of GPT-3. They apply a self-attention mechanism, have the ability to generate long strings of text, and we can engage already in seemingly intelligent conversation with them. We fine-tuned the Da Vinci model of GPT-3 with custom-fit training data. In our case, this was 2.5 million words of DANet, and DigiDan is still a pure transformer model. We just changed the weights. The fine-tuned outputs reflect a compromise between GPT-3 default weightings and weightings reflecting the structure of the new corpus we used for the fine-tuning. But most large language models we see nowadays are not pure transformers anymore, because they receive different kinds of training based on supervised reinforcement learning methods, for example, which means human evaluations serve as additional training data, for example, to avoid that the model starts to reproduce biases that are in the training data used for pre-training. And as you all know, models are scaled up, meaning they are getting bigger and bigger due to more training data and more parameters, and the number of tokens that they can handle is increased as well. But I think Thomas will give us more details about all these different kinds of models we are confronted with. And I tell you how DigiDan was created. Before we started with DigiDan, we went through several pilot experiments. So we fine-tuned a model with Kant's work in English translation. However, for me as a German native speaker, an English-speaking Kant was not really convincing. Then we fine-tuned a model with a collection of philosophical blog posts. The experiences we made with those pilot studies were sufficiently encouraging for us that we fine-tuned GPT-3 on Daniel Danner's corpus to create DigiDan. If you're interested in this blog post piloting, you can go on the QR code or write down the internet address on the slide, and then you see how convincing the outputs of our block model already were. Now I give you a short introduction in all the steps you have to take if you want to fine-tune a large language model. Before fine-tuning, and this was most of the work we had to do, I manually edited Dan's work so that it was in a presentable format to serve as training data. So after stripping away headers, footnotes, scanning errors, marginalia, and other distractions, I converted 15 books and 269 articles and interviews, amounting to a little more than 2.5 million words, into machine-readable TXTs. The next step, after this dinner was ready, we had to transform the TXTs into a JSON format, as you can see on the right side of the slide. And if you, I'm not quite sure who is a computer scientist in the audience and who is not. So just to explain what you see from this JSON-L training data thing, you have two parts in this brackets. First, you put something in what you call prompt, and then you put something in what you call completion. And in our case, we did not fill anything in the prompt part. We only filled in something in the completion part. So what we did is, by transforming the TXT into the JSON-L format, and we applied an open-ended generation strategy. So there are many different strategies you can take if you're doing fine-tuning, and we decided that that one would be the most successful one. So that means we left all prompts empty and filled the completions with the maximum amount of 1024 tokens. And now this sounds really historical, because nowadays you can put much more tokens in one completion if you want to. But these days it was limited to 1024. According to the manual of OpenAI, you need at least 1000 lines in this fine-tuning material for successful fine-tuning. And we, as you can see, we had over 1,800. So then we fine-tuned the pre-trained model, and this was the beginning of DigiDan. But playing with the machine, we saw that it's not that easy to really evaluate the performance. And now I will tell you how we tested the performance of DigiDan. We made a huge experiment. First, we asked Dennett to give us answers to 10 philosophical questions. And then we posed the same questions to DigiDan and collected 4 responses for each of the 10 questions. After that, we recruited over 400 participants, 25 experts in Dennett works, 304 blog readers, and 100 ordinary online research participants into an experiment in which they had to distinguish Dennett's real answers from the answers generated by DigiDan. This included a guessing and a rating task, and we had 3 hypotheses. We assumed that expert respondents would perform better than ordinary research participants. And we thought that the expert respondents would on average guess correctly at least 80% of the time. And as we also had a rating task for all participants, we also hypothesized that expert respondents will rate Daniel's actual answers as more Dennett-like than DigiDan's answers. Now I will tell you some details about how we collected the answers from the machine, from DigiDan. Completion of all large language models are highly sensitive to the content and structure of the prompts. Good prompt engineering is very important for coaxing useful replies. So far, from my perspective, prompt engineering is rather an art than a subject of scientific clear-cut methods. We settled on a very simple prompt. As you can see on the slide, all we put into the machine is interviewer And there we filled in the question, and then in the next line there was Dennett. And this simple prompt has several advantages. First, the minimal structure reduces potential concerns about the prompt possibly nudging completions towards specific philosophical content. This prompt encouraged DigiDan to speak in the first person, voicing Dennett's view rather than speaking in the third person about Dennett. And the simple format makes it easily to generalize to other cases, I hope, of course. And to say something about the prompt engineering, so maybe you can imagine this very small prompt is doing something, and that's anthropomorphical speaking for me now, like telling the machine, imagine all the interviews you have seen. They are all in the structure like the interview is asking a question, and you, then a person is answering the question. And I mean, of course, this is wrong saying it, like I said, but it's just to imagine how we can sort of put the probabilities of getting the machine to speak in the first person is because by this prompt, the weights of all the interview texts in the corpus get higher than the other weights. And I think Thomas will, again, be the one who will give you more details about this. We gather completions in the GPT-3 playground using our prompt, applying the OpenAI default settings. And I think it's important to emphasize that that the perceived quality of a response was never used as a basis for selection. This means we did not really cherry pick responses that we judge better or more Dennett-like or more likely to fool our participants. All we did that is something what I call mechanical cherry picking. We selected answers that met two criteria. And just to tell you, most of the answers we received from DigiDan met the criteria in the beginning. There were only some questions where we had to go for several trials to get the criteria right. So in order to have answers that were comparable lengths to Dan's answers, we truncated DigiDan's responses. And we excluded answers with very obvious cues, such as output that contained the word interviewer or Dennett. Finally, we regularized curly quotes to straight quotes, single quotes to double quotes, and dashes to M dashes. And all that, I would still say, is just mechanical cherry picking. Then our participants had to go to the experiment. It was an online questionnaire, and they had two tasks, the guessing task and the evaluation task, which you can see on the slide. And for reasons of timing, I will not say much about it, and we'll just jump to the results right now. So, as you can see, expert respondents performed better than ordinary research participants, but experts did not outperform the block readers, and they did not reach the 80% as we thought they would. Ordinary research participants were near the chance rate of 20%, whereas block readers, 48%, and Dennett experts, 51%, were significantly better than chance. So on the one hand, we were happy that our machine performed so well, but on the other hand, we were worried that even Dennett experts cannot reliably distinguish written text written by Dennett and written text written by the DigiDan. So also the results confirm two of the three hypotheses. We have to say that the Dennett experts did not satisfy the thing what we thought they could. So we were thinking that expertise is something what really helps us to distinguish machine-generated text and human-created text. But as it turns out, it doesn't. And I would say our model is a very old model. It's GPT-3. If you would do the same thing with GPT-4 or future large language models, it will get even worse. And maybe in the end, all the humans are just at the chance level. What was interesting is that 9 answers of the machine answers we had in our experiments were not chosen by any expert. And of course, we did some further research and try to find out why did they not choose it. And I think there are really hard, clear-cut reasons. Those answers were not at all like what Dennett would say. They were representing a significant failure of the fine-tuning project to reliably represent Dennett's view. And I think this is a very important message, that not all answers are trustworthy. And how do you know which one is a trustworthy one and which one not? Another objection many people gave us as we presented DigiDan in the beginning was that maybe DigiDan was overtrained. So I had the impression that many people seem to believe that large language models are like parrots, or wonder whether therefore wonder whether DigiDan was overtrained and simply parroting sentences or multi-word strings of text from Dennett's corpus. Therefore, to exclude this idea, we checked with a Turnitin plagiarism checker, checking for a match between unusual strings of words in the target document and similar strings in the comparison corpora. Similarity thresholds below 10 to 15% are considered ordinary in non-plagiarized work. And we found only 5% overall similarity between DigiDan's answers and the comparison corpora. And none of the passages were marked as similar to the training corpus we used in fine-tuning. But as the Turnitin plagiarism check process is not really transparent, so we don't know what it is really checking for, we even went for a more transparent process of searching for matching strings by using the n-gram package from the R programming language by Schmidt and Heckendorf. And I will not explain how that worked. If you're really interested in that, you can go to our paper where we have a whole section about that. And what I can report that we only found, excuse me, 21 matching strings. And those matching strings were not even things which were typical for Dennett. There were just phrases which are typical for philosophers of mind and language, I would say. So, and 21 regarding the 3,240 words is not a high number. But this is just a side information, because now I want to spend the rest of time to jump over risks which came to my mind and my colleagues as we were working with DigiDan. Before aiming for further fine-tuned large language models, I think accompanying risk should be evaluated. Since the time is already well advanced, as I can see on my watch, I will make only few brief remarks on this subject. I have discussed this in more detail in an essay entitled On Pitfalls and Advantages of Sophisticated Large Language Models. And you can just read this if you want to know more about that. My first remark is just about copyright. Copyright law governing large language models is not yet settled. I think it's unclear whether it's fair use of intellectual property to fine-tune a large language model on the works of a single author. Somehow there is something happening like idea borrowing via fine-tuned language models. And even though it's undetectable as plagiarism, it might be rightly considered as a new form of plagiarism. Until the law is settled, I would say it is best to seek the explicit permission of the author before fine-tuning and publishing any outputs of a fine-tuned model. And it remains an open question how to deal with works by deceased authors. The next point regarding the risks is over-reliance. I showed you that we had at least 9 answers which were just wrong. And so I think looking at all the outputs, it's not good enough to rely on them. DigiDan did not reliably produce outputs representing DAN networks. And this is not surprising because all deep learning networks do have problems with reliability. Nevertheless, users might mistakenly assume that outputs are likely to reflect the actual view of an author. That might be tempting, especially for students or social media users or others who might rather query a fine-tuned model of an author than read the author's work. And I'm sure that many people in the audience rather ask ChatGPT than reading some information about something they want to know. But I recommend substantial caution before releasing any language model fine-tuned on an individual author to the public, because we cannot avoid that people over-rely on them. I will not say anything about counterfeits because you have heard enough of this in the interview you have seen, and I will close my talk with two thoughts about the difficulty to distinguish and some long-term potentials. So, since machine output is obviously hard to distinguish from human-generated output, we will be confronted with further problems. For example, how can teachers in the future ensure that the submitted essays are not simply a product of a language model? Perhaps universities, like it already happened in Australia, will return to supervised essay writing in person. More generally, we have to ask ourselves how we can deal with verifiable authorship with respect to the mass of electronically distributed text. And how can we know whether in a chat conversation we are interacting with a human and not with a chatbot? And how can we trust in the content of websites, whether if we don't know whether it was a large language model who constructed the content? And how can we trust in video calls? How do you know that I'm a human being? All those questions lead to the question of whether we will establish new social practices that aim at proving that one is really the original author and what is written and said, and proving that I am a human and not just a very sophisticated large language model. I started my talk with the question of whether philosophy is safe from the AI takeover. And I would be interested to hear what you think about this and what you think about computer programs that generate music in the style of a particular composer, or of image generation programs, or of future language models that generate text on behalf of the users. Do they outperform even expert humans? My take on this is that future large language models might be an interesting thinking tool used by humans. I hope, at least, it will turn out this way. They might produce outputs interesting enough to serve as a valuable source of cherry picking by experts, and some of the selected outputs might have substantial merit. I would even go so far and say that an author might create many outputs, choose the most promising one, edit them lightly, and present them not unreasonably as original work.
Thank you so much, Anna.